On October 29, 1910, George William McClellan was the 24th person to be born in Whately, Massachusetts. He was the firstborn child to parents Randolph Allen McClellan and Mildred Harriet Weber. The proud parents announced his birth in the Gazette and Courier, a newspaper out of Greenfield, Massachusetts. 3 years later, on April 2, 1913, the couple welcomed their second child, Florence Elizabeth, also known as Betty. Completing the family was Albert Weber, who was born on April 1, 1916. As can be seen in the 1920 U.S. federal census, the children grew up in a house on the family farm in South Whately. They were living right next door to their grandparents, George Briggs and Mary Elizabeth McClellan. They were educated at Whately Center School, located about 1.5 miles north of the McClellan residence on Chestnut Plain Road. The school was built in 1910 to replace the South Center School, which was about halfway between the two, also on Chestnut Plain Road. Constructed of brick in the Georgian Revival style, it has brick walls and a steep front stairway leading to a pediment portico that is supported by both paneled posts and Doric columns. The center school was Whately's most elaborate institutional building at the time. Although this picture shows a car in front, students would have ridden to school on horseback or wagons. As shown in this model, it was a two-room schoolhouse with children of various ages being in the same classroom. The school was heated with coal when most of the homes and buildings in town were still using wood. There was no electricity until 1926. Plumbing wasn't installed until 1930. The school closed when the new elementary school, located on Long Plain Road, opened for students in 1991. The town administrative offices along with the police and health departments then occupied the building, as did the Whately Historical Society, which would display various artifacts related to Whately life. Out in front of the building is the famous milk bottle. George's parents divorced in 1926. Harriet and the 3 children moved to Northampton, Massachusetts, a town just south of Whately. While living there, teenage George began working at Norwood Engineering Company as a clerk. This experience would shape his career going forward. When the 15th U.S. Census was enumerated in April of 1930, the family was now living in New Britain, Connecticut. Randolph's name was absent, and we can see that Harriet had been listed as having been divorced. George, almost 20, and Florence, 17, were both listed as working in a hardware factory. George, as a novice clerk. And Florence, as a timekeeper. In the city directory that same year, we see that George is now working at Russell and Irwin, also known as American Hardware. Also, here we can see that Harriet is listed as being Randolph's widow. Randolph would not die until 1963. George worked most of his life at Russell and Irwin, a manufacturing company in the heart of the city. They produced doorknobs, padlocks, and other door hardware. Some of these were extremely ornate, as we can see in this artistic lion's head hinge. With numerous large manufacturing firms located in the city, New Britain drew people from all over the world seeking steady employment. New Britain seemed like it withstood the Great Depression better than most towns. In fact, on a per capita basis, the Industrial Revolution took hold in New Britain like nowhere else in the country. Commonly known as Black Thursday, the October 24, 1929 stock market crash was attributed in part to a vast imbalance of wealth between the rich and poor, little to no wage gains, an increase in personal debt, and government mismanagement. At the height of the Depression in 1933, about 1/4 of the total workforce, or 12,830,000 people, were unemployed. The average American family lived by the Depression-era motto, use it up, wear it out, make do or do without. Those that were lucky enough to have steady employment often saw their wages cut, or their hours reduced to part-time. It's estimated that more than 2 million men and women became traveling hobos. Many of these were teens who felt they had become a burden on their families and left home in search of work. The Depression lasted about 10 long hard years. Regardless of employment, people were unwilling to spend money on entertainment for fear of losing their jobs. It must have been hard for George to socialize with a mother and two siblings to support. Luckily, a co-worker of his, William M. Fisher, thought that George should be introduced to his sister-in-law, Miss Gladys Munson.
Gladys Dorothy Munson was born in 1917 in New Britain, Connecticut to Swedish immigrant parents, Johann Alfred Munson and Emma Augusta Svenningsdotter. According to her birth certificate, she was born on September 5th. However, she always celebrated her birthday as the 4th. The reason for the discrepancy most likely is because the information was recorded a week later by the midwife, who was the informant on her birth certificate. The number of children living was also incorrectly given as 6, when Gladys's parents had 7 other children living at the time of her birth. Gladys was the youngest of all the Munson children. Her other siblings were Ruth, Edith, Ellen, Edward, Frank, Jenny, and Alfred. When Gladys was born, her mother was 43 years old. There was a big age gap between Gladys and most of her siblings. Her youngest sibling was 3 years older than her. The next one from there was 10 years older, going all the way up to a 23-year age gap. At the time of her birth, Gladys was living in New Britain, a city in the heart of Connecticut. Located about 20 minutes southwest from Hartford, the family was living at 179 Greenwood Street. The family moved a couple times before settling at 301 Kensington Avenue sometime before Gladys was 3 years old. The property lies on the boundary of New Britain and Kensington, 3/4 of a mile from where she was born. In the 1920 U.S. federal census for New Britain, Gladys was living with her parents, John and Emma, and 4 of her siblings, Edward, Frank, Jenny, and Teddy. By the time the 1930 census was taken in April, with all her other siblings being married and living on their own, only Gladys and her brother Teddy were living with their parents. Sadly, a little over a year later, on June 16, 1931, her father John died after a short illness at the age of 59. Gladys was 2.5 months shy of her 14th birthday. She dropped out of high school before graduating because her other siblings were raising families of their own, leaving only Gladys and Teddy to help support their mother. Just 4 short years later, still grieving the loss of her father, Her brother Edward died tragically at the age of 34. According to the New Britain Herald, he had an injury to his forehead, yet death was due to a heart attack. It goes on to say that at first it was believed that Munson was the victim of a hit-and-run driver or that he was assaulted and left on the street. Gladys, not even 18 years old, had to identify the body. The family moved out of the home in 1936 or 37, possibly to cut down on the rent of the house. Then, Gladys met George. We're looking at a marriage license filed in the town of New Britain. The groom is listed as George McClellan and the bride was Gladys Munson. George was 27 and Gladys was 20 at that time. George was still working as a clerk at Russell & Irwin while Gladys was working as an inspector at Stanley Works. They signed their application on the 23rd day of July, 1938. Because she was under 21 years old, she needed consent from her mother to get married. William Fisher, Gladys's brother-in-law who introduced them, was a witness to the signature. The couple were married on August 6, 1938 by Pastor Raymond Gilman of Stanley Memorial Church at his home at 29 Howard Street in New Britain. For their honeymoon, the couple took a motor tour of northern New England. After the couple were married, George moved in with Gladys and her mother Emma, as seen in the 1940 census.
During this period, Europe was in the grips of war. The United States was not yet a participant, but the whole world was keeping their eye on the events. On September 16, 1940, Congress enacted the Burke-Wadsworth Act, also known as the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. This act required that men who had reached their 21st birthday but had not yet reached their 36th register with local draft boards. "29-year-old George filled his card out on October 16th. President Roosevelt addressed the nation.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked.
George's brother Albert was drafted on August 17, 1943. 5 months later, both George and his brother-in-law, Ernest William Johnson, also known as Bill, were drafted on January 19, 1944. By February 19th, George was in New Jersey at Camp Edison for his basic training. On March 25th, George graduated basic training as a member in the 2nd Training Company, 848th Battalion.
Lift your head and hold it proud!
Lift your head and hold it proud!
We're running fast and we're sounding loud!
Anytime George had leave, he made sure to spend his precious time with his loved ones, not knowing if they'd ever see each other again. George spent time at Camp Edison and Camp Wood, both in New Jersey, learning to become a message center clerk. Then, on September 28, 1944, he departed the United States heading to the Philippines, where he arrived on October 22nd. This was the same area where the infamous Bataan Death March happened approximately a year and a half earlier. About 76,000 prisoners of war, about 10,000 of which were American, were marched by the Japanese almost 66 miles starting from the Bataan Peninsula to San Fernando. The prisoners were then ushered onto a train to Capiz, eventually ending at Camp O'Donnell, a Japanese military prisoner camp north of Capiz. During the main march, which lasted 5 to 10 days, depending on where a prisoner joined it, the captives were beaten, shot, bayoneted, and, in many cases, beheaded. A large number of those who made it to the camp later died of starvation and disease. Only 54,000 prisoners reached the camp. Though exact numbers are unknown, some 2,500 Filipinos and 500 Americans may have died during the march. An An additional 26,000 Filipinos and 1,500 Americans died at Camp O'Donnell. Less than 2 weeks after George arrived in the South Pacific, Gladys's mother Emma died at the age of 71 after a long illness. She had spent the last 2 years in a convalescent home in New Britain. Times were tough for Gladys. With her mother passing, her husband halfway around the globe, she tried to stay positive and spend time with loved ones. If anyone could understand what she was going through, it was her sister-in-law Betty, whose husband was also away. And also her mother-in-law Harriet, with 2 sons and a son-in-law off to fight the war. Praying they would come home safe.
He was a famous trumpet man from out Chicago way. He had a boogie style that no one else could play. He was the top man at his craft. But then his number came
During
up
downtimes, he and his fellow soldiers would tour Manila, visit ruins, and generally try to keep things light, as to take their mind off the war.
It really brought him down because he couldn't jam. The captain seemed to understand.
He sent home lighthearted pictures with big smiles, so as not to worry his wife back home.
When he plays reveille, he's the boogie-woogie bugle boy of Company B. A toot, a toot, a toot-a-toot, he blows it eight to the bar. In boogie rhythm, he can't blow a note unless the bass and guitar.
He wanted to spare her the terrifying details of war.
He makes a company jump when he plays reveille. He's the boogie-woogie bugle boy of Company B. He was a boogie-woogie bugle boy of Company B.
Things such as how his ship had been torpedoed on the ride over.
He was busy as a bee. And when he plays, he makes the company jump eight to the bar. He's a boogie-woogie bugle boy of Company B. He blows it eight to the bar.
Or how on the march, they noticed a man lying on the ground moving around, possibly injured.
And the company jumps when he plays reveille. He's the boogie-woogie bugle boy of Company B.
Upon closer inspection, they had discovered it was a dead body, filled with thousands of maggots, which mimic movement. But no, some things are better left unsaid. He would share these stories with his sons when they got older.
Because they know how he plays. When someone gives him a beat, he really breaks it up. When he plays reveille, he's the boogie-woogie bugle boy of Company B.
George would spend a little over 9 months there during the war, returning stateside on July 9, 1945. He would spend some time at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. until his discharge from the Army on September 5, 1945, with a certificate of disability and an honorable discharge. George's official war records were destroyed in 1973. A fire at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri destroyed 80% of Army records and 75% from the Air Force. Luckily, George retained his discharge papers. In them, we get valuable information of his military career. For instance, he received an honorable discharge. He obtained the rank of Technician 5th grade for the Army Signal Corps. The unit he was discharged from was Detachment X, 4025th Signal Service Group. He was discharged on September 5, 1945 from Walter Reed General Hospital in Washington, D.C., 3 days after the war in Japan ended. He had blue eyes, brown hair, was 5 foot 5 inches tall, weighed 121 pounds, and had one dependent. He was inducted on January 19th and entered active duty on February 9th, 1944. He was trained as a message center clerk. He earned the Rifle Sharpshooter Badge on April 4, 1944. He was involved in battles and campaigns in New Guinea, the southern Philippines, and Luzon. He was awarded the Asiatic Pacific Theater Medal with 3 campaign stars, and also the Philippines Liberation Medal with 1 Bronze Star. He departed the U.S. on the 28th of September and arrived at the Asiatic Pacific Theater on October 22, 1944. It is unsure when he left the Philippines, but he was back in the States on July 9, 1945. His total service time was 9 months, 14 days of continental service, and 9 months, 12 days of foreign service. The reason for the discharge is because he received a certificate of disability. In order for this to be official, George was required to leave his right thumbprint and his signature.
Now that the war was over, George and Gladys tried resuming their lives. George went back to work at Russell and Irwin. He was still working with his brother-in-law, Bill Fisher. George and Gladys set up home at 114 Monroe Street during this time. On November 25, 1946, the couple welcomed their first child, Barry George McClellan. Ronald William McClellan joined the family on July 12, 1949.
Parigi cara, noi lasceremo la vita uniti trascorreremo, dei corsi affanni compenso avrai, la tua salute rifiorirà, sospiro e luce tu mi sarai, tutto il futuro ne arriderà.
Parigi cara, noi lasceremo la vita uniti trascorreremo, i corsi affanni compenso avrai, la mia salute rifiorirà.
During the late summer of 1950, Edwin Hills and Emma Hills Boyd sold their property in Plainville to Gladys and George McClellan. It was known as Lot Number 4 but would soon become 45 Welch Street. On September 16, 1950, the couple had officially bought their own home. Then on February 27, 1953, Bruce Alfred McClellan was born.
Libiamo negli edi conici che la bellezza infiora, e là fuggevo l'ora s'innebriavo l'uta, libionne dolci fremiti che suscita l'amore, poiché quell'occhio al cuore ogni poteva. Amor fra i conici più caldi baci avrà.
On August 14, 1962, George's mother Harriet passed away in Bristol Hospital at the age of 69. She had been retired for only 2 years after previously working at the Fair department store in New Britain for 18 years. Besides her children, she was survived by her sister Florence and 6 grandchildren. She was buried in West Cemetery in Plainville on August 16. Ten months later, his estranged father died on June 11, 1963. He was 78 years old. Prior to his retirement in 1961, he had worked 2 years at the Valmar Tool Company, and 17 years at Pratt & Whitney. He was buried in Hillside Cemetery in East Hartford. By 1971, their children all graduated high school, something neither George nor Gladys had the opportunity to achieve. When Bruce went off to college, Gladys took a job at Klingberg Children's Home to help defray the cost of Bruce's college tuition. George retired about 1972. Although she was hired to be a cleaning lady, she graciously played the role of an unofficial counselor, which led to many of the children adoring her. Gladys must have been well aware of this place as she grew up in the backyard for most of her childhood. George William McClellan passed away on January 26, 1982. He had been suffering from acute and recurrent pneumonitis for many months. Another contributing factor was Felty's syndrome, which he had for many, many years. According to medlineplus.gov, Felty's syndrome is described to be a disorder that includes rheumatoid arthritis, a swollen spleen, decreased white blood cell count and repeated infections. They classify it as a rare disease. Symptoms included were joint swelling, stiffness, pain, and deformity. George's knuckles were swelled to the size of golf balls and was extremely debilitating. George was cremated. Gladys spread his ashes in the flower bed in front of the home they had made together. Having lost her husband of 43 years, Gladys spent her remaining years spending time with loved ones, and caring for her family, especially her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. After spending a few years in Plainville Healthcare Center, Gladys Dorothy Munson McClellan went to be with her husband George at the age of 89. She left a hole in many hearts. It was the end of a generation. The greatest generation. As of February 2024, George and Gladys left behind 3 children, 7 grandchildren, 9 great-grandchildren and 1 great-great-grandchild.